Good afternoon, one and all. My name is Dan Banks. I'm a PhD student, first year at the University of Hull, studying music performance, so it's all quite incipient at the moment. I'm also a practitioner, so a jazz pianist, nearly 2 decades of experience, and a professional musician as well, so I've kind of done the jazz thing and then also the working musician thing, playing Dancing Queen on a Saturday night at someone's wedding, done the whole thing. Today, so my PhD project is really kind of very much related, so it's going to be very interesting. I'm examining the nature and character of interaction in jazz performance, with a particular interest in the trio performances of Chick Corea from his Rendezvous in New York DVD. So today, I apologise for these transitions. Everyone else had really cool transitions. Mine were a bit 90s in comparison. Sorry about that. So today I'll outline my theoretical framework for considering interaction in jazz performance and discuss the role that practice-led research has had on my research, my project. I'm particularly interested, or more broadly interested, in just all my experience as a practitioner, so not just the performance portfolio associated with the PhD. As a preamble to this, I'll outline some current thinking and scholarship relating to interaction in jazz performance. Now, a little apology, I was hoping to have an equal discussion on interdisciplinarity and performance, but this being quite a new thing to me, I found that too heavy to talk about both of those things, so I'm just going to focus on performance today. First, perhaps, I thought I might take a moment to just broadly define what interaction in jazz performance means for me. So when I've been discussing this with non-musicians, I found myself calling upon quite a well-trodden metaphor, and that is, music is like language, conversation is like improvisation. This kind of it's helped non-musicians understand this notion of interaction in jazz performance. So just take for a moment to think how conversations evolve, how each person listens and responds, how the pace of the conversation ebbs and flows, how contributions might converge or diverge, how each person's individual unique syntactical and linguistic characteristics might manifest, all the while occurring in a framework both concerning the structure and the syntax of the language being used, and of course the topic being discussed, and then wider kind of cultural contexts. Now, obviously, it's not as easy as just substituting the word conversation and popping in improvisation. It's a bit more complex than that. And to that end, I thought it might be nice for us to sort of see and hear some interaction. We've already seen that and experienced some today. I'm just going to show you a video of my trio. It's just a little moment, 2-minute video of that I think is quite a nice moment of interaction. In this clip, we're improvising freely, so it's free jazz. We're completely free, there's very little constraint. There's one constraint, and there's an underlying sonification that creates a drone. So I suppose our only constraint is tonality, we're kind of tied to a tonality. I'll just signpost a few little moments of interaction that I think are quite interesting. So early on, there's a bit of call and response, but it's not as simple as just A, B. It's kind of between 3 of us, and there's got some nice overlapping moments. Then we'll move towards an increase in texture, so we're kind of interacting by increasing textural and dynamic intensity. Then there's a decrease in texture following that, of course, and then the beginnings of some new, exploring new soundscapes. So I suppose here the point I'm making is interaction doesn't have to necessarily be very specific, it can be quite abstract as well. So perhaps let's give it a quick little listen if everything's working. so next I'd like to just provide a little bit of context. So I'm going to talk a bit about the current kind of thinking and scholarship on interaction in jazz performance. I kind of broadly categorise these into two schools of thought. So those examining interaction from a linguistic stance, and those investigating interaction through the notion of convergence and divergence. Of course, there's quite a lot of other more novel studies that don't sit neatly into those two schools, but I'm going to not discuss those today. Two works that sit soundly in the linguistic paradigm are the books Saying Something and Thinking in Jazz by Ingrid Monson and Paul Berliner, respectively. Both of these works explore the mosaic world of jazz via the methodology of ethnography, explicating and describing phenomena from the perspective of the subject, the jazz musician. Berliner's work is a vast exploration of the world of jazz, considering issues such as musicians' earliest experiences of music, pedagogical concerns of learning harmony, rhythm and melody, and concerns regarding interactional principles of performance. In the chapter on interaction, Berliner posits two useful metaphors, often cited by jazz musicians to discuss the give and take of ensemble playing. One metaphor likens group improvisation to a conversation the players carry on among themselves in the language of jazz. The second likens the experience of improvising to going on a demanding musical journey. Berliner doesn't necessarily develop a framework from these two metaphors, but instead in the chapter talks about practical strategies that jazz musicians deploy to foster interaction. But Berliner certainly laid the groundwork for a more detailed thesis on interaction, and that was provided by Ingrid Monson. Monson's thesis evolves from an extensive ethnographic study of jazz musicians, again looking at the importance of interaction in jazz performance. Some of the ideas traversed by Monson include a distancing from reductionist and logocentric pitfalls of viewing musical sound as text, the introduction of the concept of intermusicality, a useful rubric which redefines intertextuality with a more inclusive focus on music, and a close analytical examination of basement blues. Next, I'd like to discuss the two works that forming the convergence-divergence paradigm. Given the work of Monson and Berliner explore the interstices between the musical and the extra musical, forging interdisciplinary connections with broader issues of culture and practice, the convergence-divergence school of thought is perhaps slightly more analytical in focus, giving a closer consideration of the phenomena, its manifestation and character. Both the works discussed here build their frameworks from the work of psychologist Keith Sawyer. A detailed discussion of Sawyer's work is probably outside the scope of today's presentation. However, he has suggested a bi-stage model of improvisatory interaction, primarily developed for improvised theatre. In this model, agents and auditors filter ideas through a divergent problem-searching stage through to a convergent problem-solving stage. So moving on, the first musicologist to apply this convergence-divergence concept to an examination of interaction in jazz performance was Paul Steinbeck in his article Area by Area the Machine Unfolds, the improvisational performance practice of the Art Ensemble of Chicago. Here he conceptualizes the ensemble's performances as networks of group interactions. These networks, which Steinbeck calls interactive frameworks, are similar to Leonard Meyer's style systems, defined as complex systems of sound relationships, understood and used in common by a group of individuals. Steinbeck recasts this as musical structures that are experienced interpersonally among a community of composers, performers, and auditors. From this vantage point, Steinbeck observes that there is a sense of directionality in the performances of the art ensemble, in that at some points they appear to move towards a musical consensus, while at other moments they're multi-directional or multi-centered in their performance. It's as a result of this observation that Steinbeck incorporates Keith Sawyer's notions of convergence and divergence. And it's interesting that in that study, the art ensemble, they move through consecutive stages, so it's not like they're being convergent and divergent concurrently. They're having a moment of divergence and then a moment of convergence. The second musicologist to explore the convergence-divergence concept was Garrett Markelson in his thesis analysing musical interaction in jazz improvisations of the 1960s. He creates a more generalised moment-to-moment framework for considering interaction. Markelson also entwines his concept of convergence and divergence with a notion called projection. This notion is also born of the work of Leonard Meyer, but in this case, Meyer's notions of expectation and implication, with Markelson positioning his concept of projection between these two ideas. So Markelson defines convergence and divergence as when two streams project similar futures, I will describe them as convergent. When two streams project dissimilar futures, I will describe them as divergent. It's with this notion of projection that Michelson's framework and my own diverge. To that end, I'll move on to discussing my framework and practice that goes alongside that. So quite early in my research, it became apparent to me that to suppress input from my perspective as a performer would be detrimental, and I don't think is even actually possible. In recent months, I've concluded that my view as a performer and my view as an analyst here have a fundamental dialogic relationship with my emic performer perspective, presupposing my etic analyst hearer perspectives. Peter Reinholdson, in his book Making Music Together, discusses in detail this interconnectivity, and as part of his thesis, developed quite an interesting little diagram to just visualise it. I've kind of altered it and simplified it. So this diagrammatic representation is intended to shed light on the relationship between actor and analyst, providing an ideal typification of the immediate first-order, moment-to-moment listening perspectives for players, analysts, and hearers. So the interrelationship between the emic and the etic and its relevance and impact on my research is a topic that I'm still kind of getting to grips with. So I'll go on and sort of talk in more detail now about my practice and how it's directly impacted the framework. So obviously there's insight to be gained from the performer's vantage point. So for example, consider for a moment the research I categorised earlier as being linguistic, born of the metaphor improvisation is like conversation. While examining this work, as a practitioner and improviser, I began asking myself, does a spontaneous conversation with someone feel the same as when I'm interacting with a group of musicians during improvisation? And the answer for me is no, it really doesn't at all, actually. Which led me to ask several questions, such as what kind of framework, model, or notion would best describe interaction in jazz performance? And then alongside this, I found myself wanting a model that moved away from notions of consonance and concord equating to interaction, so such as call and responses interaction, while dissonance or discord is either error correction, wrongdoing, or some kind of musical misstep. And then concurrent to this, I started transcribing and listening carefully to various performances by Chick Corea, but mainly, as I said, the Rendezvous in New York DVD. And it was in this space that the utility of the notions of convergence and divergence became clear to me. The idea that while improvising, we can either collectively move toward or away from specific musical parameters and notions and gestures made sense, both from my own experience as a practitioner, but also it makes sense as a tool to describe, a descriptive tool as an analyst as well. To that end, I'm using the terms convergence and divergence very loosely, sort of allowing space for the phenomena to sort of breathe, so to speak. Currently, I'm defining a moment of convergence as moving together musically, so just coming to a musical consensus. And that can be visualised by a simple graphic. A moment of divergence as just moving apart musically. It should be noted here that I'm really interested in the moment-to-moment soundscape, so I'm not really concerned with convergence or divergence with respect to an underlying referent or some fundamental structure, although that might be a consideration. Alongside this, it's also my intention that the framework gives an equal treatment to convergence and divergence. It's been my experience thus far that some of the discussions of interaction in jazz performance can tend to assign a disproportionate interactional value to convergence, while leaving moments of dissonance perhaps a little overlooked. Secondly, my framework will endeavour to describe and consider the multi-parametric or multi-dimensional nature of interaction. So my experience as a practitioner tells me that interaction is often concurrently convergent and divergent, in that while an ensemble converges on one particular musical parameter, such as, like we saw in the video, an increase in texture or dynamic intensity, we're often diverging in others, so harmony, rhythm, melody. In this sense, I'm kind of viewing convergence and divergence not as two sides of a coin, but rather an interconnected, interrelated continuum of musical phenomena. But perhaps, finally, perhaps the most incipient element of my research so far is the idea of how gesture and interaction are related, given that the two avenues that I'm exploring are my performance and a DVD. It seems important to consider the implications of watching interaction and what that says about interaction as well. So I got through that quite quickly, but to conclude today, I've just discussed briefly a little bit of context regarding literature and scholarship on interaction and interplay, and outlined my kind of incipient framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there questions?
I wondered whether this is a question where I have no idea what I'm talking about. I wondered whether you'd looked at dance, because I often thought that rather than talking with someone, it's a bit like dancing with someone, especially sometimes someone you don't know, or dancing to something you don't know how to do the steps to, in the sense of not only is it gestural, but you're what's going on here?
I haven't, but that would be an interesting avenue. I mean, of course, obviously, the movement involved with dance is very deeply connected to music as well. So,
but what I mean is that there's a sense of the activity is basically constant,
right?
Because the sort of, depending on what you play and what instrument you play and what, the speaking thing sometimes doesn't take into account that everyone's
absolutely.
talking.
I think that's. You can really kind of challenge the notion that improvisation is like conversation. Just that's a really kind of good example that in conversation.
It would have to be if we did it like this and I just talked underneath you quietly.
And I'm talking over the top of you the whole time. Yeah. It's not really the same, is it?
Yeah.
I suppose for me it's more phenomenological. I just don't feel the same. It doesn't feel like the same thing for me when I'm having a conversation, when I'm improvising and interacting with a musician. I think just that simple fact led me to feel like maybe, although of course the linguistic school has lots to say, there's perhaps another way of thinking about it as well.
I mean, sometimes one can hear things or see things that you think are interaction, kind of happening spontaneously, but actually they're rehearsed. And it's difficult to know how to draw that distinction. I remember talking to Trevor Tompkins and talking about when he was working with Bill Evans, and even talking about how some of the stuff that I always naively dreamed had kind of happened spontaneously. That wasn't the case. It was really, very carefully constructed.
Yeah, and then I suppose I was sorry talking over you.
No,
sorry, yeah.
I've read Rich End of the sentence.
And then, kind of taking that idea forward, also it's perhaps hard to discuss. When you've been improvising with a group of people for a long time, you start to share kind of common language. That's a notion I need to sort of think about and consider still.
Yeah.
I do feel like with my own practice, and certainly with the literature I'm looking at, you can say, right, okay, this is the head, and this, you can see a lot of convergence already. I've started transcribing, I'm like, okay, this is clearly all rehearsed, because it's so convergent.
Yeah.
But then you've got these big sections of improvisation where you can tell they really open out.
Yeah, sure.
So I suppose I'm more interested in this moment in the middle. That's not to say perhaps there's some utility to the model for saying this is definitely a rehearsed moment. It's so convergent, maybe it has to be rehearsed.
Yeah.
Just a quick one, I really enjoyed that, thanks very much. Just on whether, so you're sort of problems on the idea of linguistic, I guess I've looked at lots of sociolinguistic stuff and conversation analysis, for example, is turn taken, so when Dan was speaking about it happening at the same time, that is resonant with me. But wondering whether are you going to sort of completely like disavow the work of Monson, I guess, because she speaks about the intermusical, and then there's some interesting work on perceptual agency as well, which is when you sort of like you develop this quasi vocabulary in your ensemble, you are kind of second guessing what they might do, and gesture can be part of that. So there could be something there to look at as well. And then Sawyer talks about moment-to-moment contingency as well, especially when you talk about moment-to-moment convergence. That's also something which is almost like a self-moderating process whilst you're negotiating.
Yeah, I suppose I'm not going to certainly disavow that entire body of work. It's just that would be a context.
Sorry, I didn't want to use that word.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, I think that will certainly play in to my framework and has done that. You know, it's still so incipient still that I'm not quite sure what's going to be more important than what I'm going to focus on 100%.
Really interesting stuff. Cool, thanks.
Is all your work looking at the piano trio, or are you looking into other lineups, vocalists and horn players?
I mean, I don't really do much work with vocalists, so I think perhaps it would be a bit dishonest to sort of look at that. I don't know that it's just not a world that I've really kind of existed in. Certainly do a lot of work with horn players as well, and I do some free jazz stuff with horn players, and then also more kind of post-bop, kind of hard bop stuff with horn players. So I would like to explore that avenue as well. I mean, the Chick Corea stuff I'm looking at is piano trio, and I've kind of made that decision just to make the kind of thesis more manageable. I think if I open it up any wider than that, it could become a bit cumbersome. But in the practical elements, of course, I'm happy to, have done, will explore other ensembles.
Yeah, I was specifically thinking larger ensembles when you've got maybe 4 or 5 horns and how they interact on top of the layer that's underneath them. Yeah,
and I think there's also a point of kind of, there's a threshold beyond which, and I certainly feel this in the free jazz stuff, kind of putting my hat on, like my practitioner hat on, there's an upper threshold for effective interaction. So when you've got kind of 5, 6, it becomes just kind of very muddy and not very fluid. While I feel like 3, 4, that's a really nice number. You can have kind of quite a nice dialogue there. But anything beyond that, it gets a bit cumbersome.
Well, I think things just become more subtle, more. There's a big framework to work in. The interaction's still there, but it's more.
I suppose there's just a lot more risk, isn't there? There's more voices, more thing, more in the mix.
But it also comes down to section leaders and how they drive the sections and the interaction between particular sound. As outside your scope here, that's fine.
Any other? I have a question. How do you locate into this framework conducted improvisation or conduction?
I'm not sure yet. I suppose because the ensembles that I'm looking at are quite small, I don't know that they are necessarily kind of conducted. The honest answer is I'm not sure. I mean, I suppose there's an interesting discussion to be had about the role of a moderator in any improvisation, be that score, be that a moderator as members of the audience as well. But I feel like perhaps that's just a little bit out of the scope at this stage for me. But certainly it's an interesting place. Yeah.
Any other business?
I just wanted to know, what are you looking for? You said you were looking for the divergence, not the convergence. What are you actually looking for?
You mean like very detailed music?
Well, kind of both, really. It's like, what are you hoping to get out of that? And when you notice that space, that divergence is happening, how are you interpreting what?
So I suppose musically, we start quite, perhaps be quite crude with it. There's obviously going to be different types of harmonic rhythm, different types of harmonic interpretation, different rhythms, different phrase lengths, different emphasis within that phrase, different texturally, different kind of character. I don't mean texturally as a whole ensemble, I mean just each individual musician. I might be applying a very dense texture, while the drummer might be just playing a single sound. So I've got quite a broad definition of what divergent can mean. I suppose it's just not moving in towards a consensus.
But couldn't that divergence actually be convergence in that musicians are, rather than all kind of doing the same kind of gestural material, are actually just being sympathetic to each other and kind of arranging?
Yeah. I suppose I'm seeing them too as one thing.
Yeah.
So, it's not convergence and divergence, it's convergence, divergence. Yeah. It's just one thing. So, in the same way that, I think they're just profoundly interconnected.
Yeah.
So I'm not necessarily
converge on the idea of diverge.
Yes.
And so what's the interpretation then? You're looking for the interplay book, so to what end?
I suppose I'm just interested in having a more nuanced sense of what interaction looks like for me, and trying to have a more kind of balanced, I suppose it's just a more detailed account of what the interaction looks like musically.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.